The Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3 as it's most commonly known. Today, after more than 2 decades of operations, it's a massive media event, the focal point in the year for gaming news. It's the event where all of the industry titans appear, where celebrities mingle with developers, and where the show floor is one endless carnival of lights and sound. E3 was big from its very beginning in 1995, and Nintendo has been there in force from the first instance, ready to showcase its newest wares to the world. Needless to say, for Nintendo fans, E3 has meant the announcements of many great games and systems, but it's also brought a lot of surprises and a lot of twists and turns. Today, Nintendo stands poised to enter an exciting new phase of its storied history in the coming year with new hardware. The future of the company looks bright, but to get here, it's had to weather many storms and face many challengers in the arena that is E3. From failed consoles to shocking reveals to stunning blows from its competitors, the history of E3 is the story of Nintendo. It's the story of how the House of Mario went from console king to scrappy underdog to confident innovator. And it's the story of how one company's relentless search for fun kept it afloat in the face of stiff competition. This is the history of Nintendo at E3. In 1995, the very first E3 arrived in a big way at the Los Angeles Convention Center. Fed up with being relegated to the back rows and outside tents of the Consumer Electronics Show, video game publishers and hardware manufacturers decided to create their own premier event where video games were the star. While video games had been around in one form or another for decades, the creation of E3 represented a fundamental shift in the video game world. For the first time, video games weren't merely a small part of the consumer electronics umbrella. Video gaming had become its own industry. One that had its own complete universe of manufacturers, publishers, press, and devoted consumers. And if video games had become an industry, Nintendo was its engine. By 1995, the Nintendo Entertainment System and Super Nintendo Entertainment System had defined the home console market for over a decade, and characters like Mario and Zelda were household names the world over. At the first E3, Nintendo represented this industry dominance by gobbling up a quarter of the floor space at the main hall of the Los Angeles Convention Center. There, they set up hundreds of Game Boy and Super Nintendo demo stations, but Nintendo's dominance was hardly secure. Indeed, a powerful new challenger had arrived on America's shores in the form of the soon-to-be-released Sony PlayStation. On top of that, old rival Sega was set to release their graphically superior new console, the Sega Saturn, later that year.
Saturn!
Incoming!
Even Atari was on hand, pushing its ultimately doomed Jaguar system. As had been the story of E3 throughout its history, in 1995, it would prove to be a battleground. While Sega and Sony were showing off shiny new hardware with advanced graphic technology to be launched by the holiday season of the same year, Nintendo's already announced next-generation home console, then called the Nintendo Ultra 64, wouldn't be available until after the next E3. But Nintendo didn't show up empty-handed. It was displaying its own revolutionary new system in the form of the Virtual Boy. With stunning read-only graphics and a very not awkward at all headset, the Virtual Boy was designed to be a portable device that allowed for true 3D games to be played. Unfortunately, needless to say, virtual reality technology wasn't yet ready for the limelight, and it would take until the present day for the technology to make waves again at E3. While a handful of games were announced to launch with the Virtual Boy, including Mario Tennis, it would ultimately prove to be a failure with consumers. And in March of the following year, it was discontinued. E3 1995 was the first and last E3 to see any Virtual Boy content. Nintendo's E3 in 1995 wasn't a total failure, however. They showed off major upcoming Super Nintendo games, including Killer Instinct and Donkey Kong Country 2, along with the cult classic Earthbound. They also talked up their forthcoming 64-bit home console, which would be out the following year. They announced it would be simply called the Nintendo 64, dropping the word Ultra from its name. And while Sony's emergence onto the scene was certainly worrisome for Nintendo, it proved disastrous for Nintendo's main competitor, Sega. Sega, deciding it needed to get the jump on the fall North American release of the Sony PlayStation, suddenly announced, much to the surprise of major retailers including Walmart and Best Buy, that the Sega Saturn would launch immediately rather than its slated September release, and was in fact already available in stores. They announced a price of $399. Now this played right into the hands of Sony. In one of the most memorable press conferences in E3 history, President of Sony Computer Entertainment of America, Steve Race, simply approached the microphone, said $299, and walked away.
$299.
Sony also announced they would have more than 50 games available by the end of the year. Sega's sudden announcement angered retailers, with many refusing to stock the devices. And with a cheaper console with a larger library of games on the horizon in the form of the Sony PlayStation, the future of the two companies was written. Nintendo, on the other hand, would wait until E3 1996 and the launch of the Nintendo 64 to take on PlayStation and reassert itself in the rising console wars. By the time E3 rolled around in May of 1996, video game sales had been slow for 2 years running, and the launch of the Sega Saturn and Virtual Boy had proved to be an utter disaster. PlayStation was doing quite well, but some industry analysts were questioning whether the specter of the gaming crash of the early 1980s still lingered. Nintendo was banking their future on their next generation console, the N64, and E3 1996 was their big opportunity to wow North American audiences. The console itself was no surprise. Everyone knew the N64 had been in development for some time, and Nintendo had already revealed it at their Show Shinkai event in Japan almost 6 months earlier, even if with only half finished content. But expectations were high. E3 was going to be the first time finalized N64 games were going to be shown. The console had originally been developed under the codename Project Reality, a nod at its graphical power, and it was known that early N64 game developers had been developing on supercomputers to mimic what the N64 would ultimately be capable of. On top of that, with Sega and Sony's offerings already out, the N64 had the stage to itself. But Nintendo didn't disappoint. While it only had a handful of games to show, the demonstration of Super Mario 64 was met with great acclaim. Nintendo announced that the game would be packaged with all new consoles, and that the price for the system would be set at $249.99. Pilot Wing 64, which was also on the show floor, would be the only other launch title in North America. Nintendo did have other games to show, however. The modern classics Mario Kart 64, Star Fox 64, and GoldenEye were presented, along with other major titles in Doom, Star Wars Shadows of the Empire, Wave Race, Killer Instinct, and Blast Corps. Interestingly, Nintendo showed a tech demo of an untitled 3D Zelda game, although it would prove to bear little resemblance to its legendary progeny. The Gameboy Pocket also made its debut at E3 1996, the first update to the venerable handheld in 7 years. While the Pocket was simply a smaller Game Boy with an improved screen, it would represent the beginning of a near constant stream of updates to the Game Boy line, and a significant shift of resources to the handheld market. A relatively small story in the console wars of the day was Microsoft's E3 presence. The software giant was on hand to position their Windows operating system as a PC platform, and the games they had on hand surprised audiences with their graphical fidelity. While few will remember those games today, the real legacy of Microsoft's presence at E3 wouldn't be seen for another 4 years, but it would have a huge impact on the console world. But the biggest bombshell of fall that year came once again from Sony, who announced that the PlayStation would see a price drop to $199.99. Nintendo and Sega initially stood firm on their console prices, but only 1 day later, both would announce their own price drops to match. The N64 therefore saw its first price drop before it even hit store shelves. Sony was on the warpath, and with Sega already bloodied, Nintendo looked to be in its sight. It even appeared to be developing its first real mascot in the form of Crash Bandicoot. Not even Mario was safe.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
Pack up your stuff.
I got a little surprise for you here. Check it out. What do you think about that? We got real-time, 3D, lush organic environments. How's that make you feel, buddy?
Feel a little like your days are numbered?
I'm gonna have to ask you to leave.
You're hurting my elbow.
By 1997, Sony had proven themselves to be Nintendo's primary rival. Sega's fortunes in North America had worsened, and Sony had scored a major upset against Nintendo when Squaresoft broke their historical ties to Nintendo to develop Final Fantasy VII exclusively for the PlayStation. While Squaresoft's reason for the console shift were due to the increased storage of PlayStation CD-ROM format over Nintendo's cartridges, it ultimately strained the relationship between the two companies to the point that it's only recently begun to be bridged again today. That year also saw E3 move from Los Angeles to a sprawling convention floor at the Georgia Dome and neighboring Georgia World Congress Center in Atlanta, Florida. While the new two-venue space allowed a record number of exhibitors showing off some 1,500 games, it was logistically a nightmare, taking press and exhibitors alike ages to get from one booth to another. Nonetheless, the show attracted huge crowds. It was also the first time pornographic games were no longer exhibited, although nothing was done to limit the number of booth babes on hand. At the event, everyone was looking to Nintendo to announce major expansions to the N64's game library. While a number of games had already been released to critical and commercial success, the total number of titles remained comparatively low. Meanwhile, PlayStation's library of games was rapidly increasing. It had the advantage of multi-platform titles like the recent smash hit Tomb Raider that couldn't be ported to Nintendo's cartridge-based system. And PlayStation was now drawing huge crowds on the show floor not only for Final Fantasy VII, but also for its new exclusive title, Metal Gear Solid, which was announced at that E3. Nintendo, however, once again responded in strength with a slew of upcoming must-play titles, including Star Fox 64, F-Zero 64, Conker's Quest, Banjo-Kazooie, and early footage of the next Zelda game, which still had yet to be titled. GoldenEye was also on the show floor, and while many dismissed it, it drew some attention even in a year where upcoming PC shooters like Half-Life, Unreal, Quake 2, and Daikatana were making waves at the expo. The split-screen multiplayer, in particular, was making a strong case for shooters on consoles, something that would be borne out in spades in the coming year. While many expected Nintendo to announce the North American release of its upcoming disk drive for the N64, the 64DD, it was a no-show, suggesting Nintendo thought it wasn't yet ready for the North American limelight. As it turned out, it never would be, and despite a solid showing, Nintendo didn't manage to steal the show in 1997, but it had something waiting in the wings for 1998 that would do just that. Gaming had made a huge rebound by the time E3 1998 rolled around. Both Nintendo and Sony had seen a slew of major games released for their systems over the previous year, and even PC gaming was riding high. The convention was once again in the unpopular Georgia World Congress Center in Atlanta, although it was quickly announced at the start of the convention that the following year, E3 would be returning to LA. Lots of big games were on the floor, as 1998 is remembered as one of the best years in video game history. Sony exclusives included Final Fantasy VIII as well as a more complete Metal Gear Solid. The PC had major games in the near-complete Half-Life, Homeworld, and Baldur's Gate, along with the much-hyped but soon-to-be vaporware, Duke Nukem Forever. Sega was also coming in big, this time with a brand new console that could significantly outperform the competition, the Sega Dreamcast. While it made big waves, it wasn't playable, and Sega showed only limited video publicly. The announcement also suggested that Sega was ready to move away from the flailing Saturn only 2 years after its launch. Nintendo, however, had its own huge announcements. The Game Boy would be seeing its first major update with the release of the Game Boy Color. The system used primarily the same technology as the older Game Boy, but would show some colors in games designed for it. A first for handhelds, it was completely backwards compatible with all Game Boy games. At the same time, Nintendo announced that they would be bringing over the Japanese hit series Pokémon. Pokémon Red and Blue would be released later that year with color support, forever changing the gaming world for a generation of children and adults alike. Nintendo had even more, however, because the new Zelda game, now officially titled The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, was ready for prime time and was due to release later that year. The game was a huge success on the show floor and proved to be the star of the show. Deservedly so, as the game brought the venerable franchise from 2D sprites into the 3D world in a way that perfectly captured the world of Zelda while making the most of the 3D environment. It would go on to cement the N64's place in living rooms across North America, and it's widely considered one of the greatest games ever made. Along with showings of the game later to become Paper Mario, Nintendo was solidly asserting itself as a premier maker of video games in the 3D era. But it was getting late into the life cycle of the N64, and as the coming year would prove, Nintendo would have to prove itself as a hardware manufacturer once again if it was going to be able to compete. Due to the unpopularity of Atlanta's venue for E3, the Expo returned to LA once again. Where software had dominated the shows in Atlanta, hardware was once again the hot topic. Sega's Dreamcast had launched in Japan and was to hit store shelves later that year. The games they had on hand looked stellar, including Sonic Adventure and Soul Calibur. The Dreamcast would also be the first system to come packed with a 56K modem for online play. Sony was slightly behind on their hardware release, but unlike Sega, their current console wasn't struggling. In fact, it was the far and away leader in units sold, soundly beating even the N64. Nonetheless, they had graphical demonstrations of their next generation PlayStation, which had only recently been announced. An in-engine version of Final Fantasy VIII CG ballroom dancing scene showed off the power of the new tech to rival pre-rendered cinematics. Nintendo, on the other hand, didn't have much in the way of hardware to talk about. The N64 was going strong, and their focus lied there.
Let me see! What's got these guys so excited? Unbelievable!
To counter Sony and Sega, Nintendo announced their next console, the codenamed Dolphin, and later to become the GameCube. They had nothing to show and details were scarce. Nintendo only announced that it would be produced through a partnership with Panasonic and IBM. Nintendo focused instead on new N64 and Game Boy games. On Game Boy, they showed off the upcoming American release of Pokemon Yellow, the follow-up to the series that had become a North American phenomenon. The Nintendo 64 lineup, including Donkey Kong 64, Mario Golf, Kirby 64, and a more complete Perfect Dark. They also announced a port of the PC hit Starcraft 64, an interesting attempt to put a real-time strategy game on consoles, and an experiment that would not often be repeated. Also announced was the start of the groundbreaking Smash Bros. Franchise in Super Smash Bros. The game would combine most of Nintendo's largest properties into an innovative fighting game brawler that would go on to see popular iterations on each of Nintendo's future consoles. But despite a solid lineup of games and the relative commercial success of the N64 in North America, it was clear that Nintendo was falling behind, and something new was needed. The N64 was on its last legs, and the competition had to up their game once again. E3 2000 was not Nintendo's best. The PlayStation 2 was out in full force on the show floor in LA. Already out in Japan, the new and powerful console was due to launch in North America later that holiday season, and the hype was big. They also had the hottest game on the show with the upcoming Metal Gear Solid 2. Sega was also out in force. The Sega Dreamcast was also now out in North America, and despite a poor performance in Japan, it had seen some success on this side of the Pacific. At E3, they were also finally showing off some exciting uses for its bundled modem. To add to Nintendo's worries, Microsoft's entry into the gaming world years prior had finally resulted in the massive company throwing its weight behind a new console. While the Redmond, Washington-based behemoth had already announced the Xbox a few months prior, at E3 they showed off some breathtaking graphical demos of what the system would be capable of. It was clear that Microsoft's foray into the console market was nothing to dismiss. Nintendo had nothing but games to show. While they talked about their own next-generation console, now called the Nintendo GameCube, the release date was set for late the following year, meaning there'd be another whole E3 before it was close to ready. And the N64 games Nintendo did have to show looked awfully familiar. Mario Tennis, Perfect Dark, and Starcraft 64 were once again on hand, along with Kirby 64, which had been renamed Kirby 64, the Crystal Shards. Nintendo did get lots of attention for its Conker's Bad Fur Day booth, which featured an open bar and was age-restricted. The previously family-friendly squirrel had been redesigned with an attitude and an alcohol habit. Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, the sequel to the smash hit Ocarina of Time, was also on hand to bolster Nintendo's lineup. They also had an interesting game called Dinosaur Planet, which would one day go on to be retooled and renamed Star Fox Adventures for the GameCube. Nintendo was relying mostly on its handhelds to save its E3. They had the good fortune of announcing that their 100th million Game Boy had been sold earlier that month. They also had 3 new Game Boy Color Zelda games to show off, one of which would be cancelled. The other 2 would later be titled Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. Pokemon was back again with its Gold and Silver editions, and Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Color was shown off. But while Nintendo remained strong in the handheld space, Nintendo was beginning to look irrelevant in the console wars. Sony was only growing stronger and had already bitten strongly into Nintendo's market share. And with Microsoft set to come barging into the market with a console that would technologically trounce the console Nintendo was working on, the future of Nintendo was beginning to look uncertain. Indeed, as it would happen, the turn of the millennium would herald the darkest period in Nintendo's video gaming history.